The former President Mohamed Morsy was in court today at the beginning of a trial that has in fact now been deferred. Ziad Bahaa is Egypt's Deputy Prime Minister, and he's joining me now from Washington to discuss all the latest events. Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, thanks for joining me. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
What do you make of what happened in court today? The president essentially refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the court, not to mention refusing to wear that white prison uniform. And now the trial has been deferred. Where are we now in the ever-evolving politics of Egypt?
Well, we are literally in the middle of a transitional period. And during a transitional period, a lot of things happen.
No.
As long as we keep the direction straight, as long as we keep progressing towards a democratic system, then I think we should expect some things to happen in the right way, some things to take more time, some things to be bumpy. But at the end, what matters is whether we are progressing in the right direction, and I think we are.
Well, you may think you are. A lot of people think it's really slow, and the fact for every half step forward, there are 3 or 4 steps back. Let me ask you, for instance, about something that you're fighting, and that is a draft law about the sort of potentially criminalizing the act of protest. What is that all about? And why are you trying to, fight that, what looks like very harsh law that perhaps could come onto the books?
Well, it's not what I'm fighting, it is what I'm defending. And what I'm defending here is a right that Egyptians have earned with a very steep price, and that is the right to peaceful protest. And I believe that this is something that we should ensure that we preserve and that we maintain even in such difficult circumstances. But to me, this whole incident has actually been one which looks like it will have a happy ending. Because the fact that a law is proposed by the government, the fact that civil society and the political parties show some significant objection to the law, and that the government comes back again and says, well, actually, let's listen to them, let's improve the law, let's see where it's not working and we try to fix it, to me is actually a sign of progress. And I'm very happy with the outcome that this is taking so far. It may not end up being the law that anyone wants in its entirety, but I think it has shown that the capacity to dialogue and to compromise and to move forward is there.
Well, let's see what happens when it finally goes to the books. Let me play something that Mohamed Morsy said while being held incommunicado after he was detained and before his trial. We're not sure exactly when it was, but this is what he said in what looks to be some surreptitious taping.
What does coup d'etat mean? It means a setback for the institutions, and it will flip the institution balances upside down. All of Egypt is now suffering from what's happening.
So, do you agree that some of Egypt is suffering? He says all of Egypt. Many people are still pretty concerned about essentially the heavy-handedness of the current interim government, the military-backed government, which is rolling back even certain freedoms that have been gained after the revolution. Even journalists, all sorts of liberals are very concerned about what's going on. Do you at least accept that what's happened is flipping institutions on their head?
No, I think it's a time of a lot of change. It's a time of flux and of dynamism, and things are going in every direction you can imagine, but what matters is the outcome. Egyptians are suffering, but let's make no mistake about this. Egyptians are suffering as a result of the policies that were adopted, particularly during the year of the reign of ex-President Morsy. It is during that time that our experiment with democracy that we all believed we could achieve collapsed and really began to show very serious signs of deviating from a democratic path. It is during that time that freedoms began to be taken very seriously. It is during that time that the constitution was no longer upheld and respected by the elected president. The fact is that Egyptians did accept an elected president as long as he and his government were willing to follow a democratic path. But that deviated a long time ago, and this is fundamentally the cause for our suffering right now. Having said this, we need to keep our eyes fixed on not continuing in that road, and as quickly as possible, as as strongly as possible, going back to a proper path of democracy.
Let me ask you a little bit about the struggle that you seem to be waging, a bit of a lonely voice, if we're reading the signals right, coming from Egypt. You have been trying to urge restraint. I hope I'm correct in expressing it that way. That's certainly what people have been saying. Restraint by the interim government, just like then Minister Mohamed El-Baradei, who has since resigned, and you worked for him. You didn't want, and nor did El-Baradei want, the military to basically crash the Muslim Brotherhood protests. They did in the end. Tell me about that. You know, what were you trying to urge them at that time? What kind of restraint were you trying to urge, and why did those protests get broken up violently?
No, what I have been urging is simply to ensure that as we progress towards the end of the interim government's period, that we do not lose sight of what is essential to the Egyptian people, and that is economic recovery as well as the preservation of the democratic path. Once violence breaks out in society, and this I have to again remind you is violence that was primarily caused by the positions taken by the Brotherhood in the early stages. Once violence breaks down in society, once there are killings, once there are churches being burned down, once there are confrontations in the street, then you have to ensure that we do not, as a society, pay the price by foregoing freedoms and rights that Egyptians, and the youth in particular, have fought for such a long time. So my campaign is not about a deal between two sides of an equation, but rather about an overall environment where we ensure that we do not lose sight of preserving the democratic values at the end of the road.
But here you are, part of the interim government, and we'll get back to those protests in a second. But here you are, you know, giving interviews in Egypt, talking about the future. You try to talk about compromise, but that is a dirty word. You try to talk about reconciliation, or at least that's how one of your interviews was framed. And a ton of bricks came down on you. People who backed the interim government, the military, said that basically you're being a traitor. It's a dirty word now, isn't it, in Egypt, to talk about reconciliation, to talk about compromise? How difficult is this struggle for you?
It is difficult, and you're right to describe it as a dirty word, unfortunately. It's a time of polarization at a very high level, and it is precisely during those times that one has to try and look at what is ultimately better for Egypt and better for the Egyptians. I do believe that at some point we will have to reconsider and look at how to, you know, bring back into the political fold various political parties, how to ensure not necessarily that those who committed crimes are back in the fold, because this is a criminal process, but how to ensure that the youth who have entered politics perhaps on good faith, who have lost their way along the path, are not left out. We have to ensure that at some point we bring back the whole society into the political process again, at least those who are willing to play politics on the basis of peaceful politics, non-violent politics. Right now it's a polarized time, and it is difficult, but it is necessary for the future of Egypt and for the future of our kids to ensure that that voice does not get lost in the middle of this polarization.
And finally, again, how do you try to temper that polarization when even somebody like Essam El Arian, a very well-known member of the Brotherhood, who's viewed as a moderate, was arrested just last week? How do you try to get all elements of Egyptian society back into the daily political life? And are you afraid that if you don't, it could end up like Syria, with the deep polarization pitted against each other in a much more violent way?
No, I think it's polarization in the sense happening among the political elites. But I have no doubt that the vast majority, and this is where we differ fundamentally from the Syrian case, I have no doubt that the vast majority of Egyptians are actually willing and hoping that we draw the line, progress for the future, not spend too much time discussing what happened in the past, but rather look forward for the continuation and conclusion of this interim period and moving on to restoring democratic values in Egypt. I think we're on the way to doing this, but it will take effort and it will take a lot of participation by all Egyptian actors.
Mr. Bahaa El-Din, thank you so much indeed for joining me.